The International Monetary Fund and World Bank meet twice a year in Washington, D.C. to convene global finance ministers and industry leaders to deliberate how to fund some of the world's most pressing issues. The two institutions have different missions, but they work hand in hand. The IMF oversees the stability of the world's monetary system, while the World Bank's goal is to reduce poverty by offering assistance to middle-income and low-income countries. The stakes for these meetings are always high. This year, there was increased tension. Global public debt is expected to soon reach $100 trillion. That's the highest ever. And there's an increased instability. A report by the UK-based risk analyst firm Verisk Maplecroft reveals that the world's conflict zones increased by 2/3 in the past 3 years. And of course, there have been changes in the political tides as well. Populist movements brought on by global inflation after COVID, as well as increased migration due to political instability, all have led to changes in power in places like France and Germany, and most notably the United States, where Donald Trump has recaptured the White House. American political waves are felt acutely at both the IMF and the World Bank, since the U.S. government is their largest stakeholder. Soon after the election, World Bank President Ajay Banga shared with Bloomberg News his thoughts on the incoming administration.
My experience with President Donald Trump in his first term was that he listens to practical reason, give him the facts and let him take his own judgment. The private sector will only do something if it makes business sense for them. If it makes business sense for them, what I'm doing is facilitating that for them. That's a good thing to do.
So the world is changing, and with it, a greater need to educate and inform leaders about the benefit of funding initiatives that impact women and girls. With so much in flux, it's worth remembering an important fact that remains the same, that investing in gender equity programs produces real results that aren't just for women, but for societies as a whole. I'm Reena Ninan, and this is the Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women. On today's episode, the final in our series, we're focusing on the World Bank IMF meetings this fall. We dive deep into the World Bank's newly launched gender strategy. Today, we'll hear from two leaders who have been the driving force behind both creating and enacting this new vision forward. My first interview took place right in the middle of the World Bank meetings at the Atlantic Council pop-up studios. There, I had a chance to sit down with Hana Brixi. She's the Global Director for Gender at the World Bank. It's a big title with a big mandate. In her role, she's not only looking to facilitate funding for women and girls, but also gather the critical data needed to convince countries to actually make these investments. It's quite the task, but as she told me, it's a challenge she's charging into headfirst. Hana, thank you for joining us. You have launched a massive revamp as the Global Director for Gender at the World Bank. And the revamp was for the World Bank's gender strategy. Tell me what you're most excited about and what's the biggest change you're offering this time?
Reena, wonderful to see you again. I think what is most exciting is the recognition that for countries to end poverty, they must unleash the potential of women. The evidence is very clear. Income per capita could be 20% higher in countries on average if women are employed at the same rate as men. We also see that if women participate in decision-making, outcomes are much better in households, in communities, in countries. And I'm really excited that now this has become part of common knowledge, not only within the World Bank Group, but also in finance ministries, in governments, in the private sector, that investing in gender equality is the smart thing to do, as well as it is the right thing to do.
I mean, I've been tracking this for years through this podcast, and to see the transformation just in the time this podcast has been up of people in the finance world really taking this seriously. When you look at this strategy, ending gender-based violence and also having that collective action is really a main part of the strategy. Why is gender-based violence so important?
So gender-based violence is one of the most egregious forms of gender equality and human rights violation. It also has a huge human, social, and economic cost. We see that ending gender-based violence could be a major contributor to unleashing the potential of women, enabling women to have healthy and productive lives.
And how do you feel, what is the strategy that you're implementing now with this new policy that'll specifically target and help end gender-based violence?
So let me perhaps first tell you a little bit more about the strategy, because indeed, ending gender-based violence is the first objective. We also add the need to elevate human capital, especially put emphasis on sexual and reproductive health rights of women and girls. The second major objective is on expanding and enabling economic opportunities. And the third is to engage women as leaders. So all these three, of course, are interconnected, and we need to work in a concerted manner toward all three. Now, on gender-based violence, first of all, we need better data. There are surveys showing that many women in some countries, 1 in 3, in some countries even more women suffering from different forms of gender-based violence. Recently, a survey showed that the majority of women, in fact, suffer from gender-based violence online. So having data and being able to point to the problem is the first step. Then second is to make the case why it matters, and make the case also to the finance ministers so that governments actually spend resources on addressing gender-based violence, and similarly within enterprises. So there we have the data showing that, for example, in some countries, sexual harassment in transport is the key deterrent to women in accessing jobs. So as a result, most women then don't look for jobs. They are not active in the economy. They are not productive. And that, of course, has huge consequences for them, for their families, and for the entire country.
So you mean the simple concept of them not being able to get transportation to go to work because they're facing harassment, that then prevents them from even thinking to apply for a job?
Exactly. Wow. And I've seen it in so many countries also for girls. Many girls in adolescent age drop out of school. They don't finish or don't even enroll in secondary schools because they lack safe transport. What matters is to engage leaders, influencers, like traditional leaders or local religious leaders or trained teachers, to make the case against the gender-based violence. So facilitating this collective action to change norms, change behaviors is really key, and we have a lot of good examples for school-based as well as community-based approaches, and starting in the young age for adolescent girls and adolescent boys to really change their perceptions, what the relationship between men and women and boy and girl should look like.
You know, you have traveled to 28 different countries in trying to rethink the strategy. So this isn't something that you just did from your desk in Washington reading a couple of articles. You were on the ground. What were some of the biggest lessons you learned as you traveled throughout these countries? Was there one country that stood out in helping you craft your policy?
In most countries, I felt that the economic case for gender equality has been already well internalized. So the main question then was how. Right? How to make a difference. The fact that many countries have tried, they have made a lot of efforts, for example, to end gender-based violence. Right? But the results have not been there. The progress has been very slow, very uneven. But more importantly, even to identify local success stories, often in communities, often women's organizations, doing fantastic work in empowering other women. You know, I can give you one example. In India, I visited the state Gujarat and very remote villages where the Sewa, civil society organizations, they are empowering women. They are bringing innovations like a gas stove or biogas stove or precision drip irrigation. And with small investments, these women then are able to improve their livelihoods, and it has a spillover effect for the entire family and for the entire community. So often these local solutions emerge from the passion and from trying at the community level, something that also can be then brought to scale within countries and also can inspire other countries.
On the topic of sort of economic investment, you've done so much in this space of gender equality, what strategies do you think are really the most effective in increasing economic power for women?
There are, I would say, 3 dimensions. The first dimension is jobs, for women to have access to productive jobs, and which means also the jobs of the future. Today, only 30% of STEM workforce are women. right?
Globally, 30%.
Globally. So globally, looking at the STEM workforce, only 30% are women, right? So then what interventions, starting in education, role models, girls' aspiration, mentoring, how to build the pipeline for women to actually bring them, enable them to access the productive jobs. The second dimensions are economic assets. Think about land, right? In many countries, there may be equality in land ownership between men and women, but most of the land is owned by men, and husband and wives don't share land ownership.
And that affects capital.
That affects capital. That affects how women as farmers can be productive. Right? So land, mobile phones, so the whole range of economic assets. And the third dimension, enabling services. Think about childcare.
Yeah.
In many of the countries I visited, I heard from women and I heard from employers, the key constraint for employing women is lack of childcare, lack of affordable quality childcare. Of course, there is a whole range of care services. In many countries, it is the elderly care that is missing. So investing in the care economy and providing the enabling services for women. And I should say, this is not only for women. We've done research in Indonesia showing that when employees have access to affordable quality care, productivity in companies increases by 10%. Well, so that's significant.
It affects the corporate bottom line.
Exactly. So that's so having this evidence, having these examples, it makes a case for governments and for companies to invest in the services and in the opportunities for women.
If you had to make like a 30-second ad, a 30-second elevator pitch for the economic case for gender equality to convince someone who believes this is just empty words, doesn't really translate, what would you say to them?
So the evidence is clear. For countries to end poverty, they must unleash the potential of women. Women are 50% of the population, and they need to be able to engage to their full potential to contribute to economic and social development of countries. We see that this is not only questions of bringing women into the labor force, but it's also a question of productivity. And companies that have more women in decision-making and they have more women in the workforce, the profitability is higher. We see that, think about food security. Many countries are really working hard to improve agriculture, agriculture productivity, food security, and nutrition security. In most countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, the majority of farmers are women. On average, their agriculture productivity is 24% lower than the productivity of male farmers. Why? Because they don't own the land, they don't have access to information, they don't have access to seeds, they don't have access to fertilizers. Why they don't have access? Because of gender constraints, because they cannot travel to meet the agricultural extension workers, or because the agriculture extension workers are males and women are not permitted to meet with them. So these are gender constraints that reduce agriculture productivity, that affect the food security of countries. Now, think about leadership, women's leadership. We see that when women participate in decision-making, the outcomes are better within households, in terms of nutrition, in terms of education, human capital of children. We see it within communities. Resilience in communities, disaster risk preparedness is better when women participate in decision-making. So we have a lot of evidence that makes the case very clear.
Hana, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Reena.
So let's take a minute to recap what we just heard from Hana Brixi. For countries to end poverty, they must unleash the potential of women. Coming up, we see what that means in practical terms when it comes to gender financing. My conversation with Anna Bjerde, Managing Director of Operations at the World Bank, is after the break. Welcome back to The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, a production of Foreign Policy. I'm Reena Ninan. If there's one takeaway from hanging out at the World Bank IMF meetings this year, it was that I was definitely on the turf of the bigwigs. These are the leaders charged with making decisions that impact millions of people and whose policy initiatives can result in life-changing improvements, not just for women and children, but for societies as well. One of the people making those decisions is Anna Bjerde. As managing director of operations at the World Bank, she personally oversees a portfolio of programs worth about $340 billion, including many gender equality projects. She's also in charge of leading new reforms at the bank to make it more efficient. I met her in her office at the World Bank, situated on a special floor reserved for executives at the bank. Our conversation centered around these larger reforms and how they're being received across the globe.
Why are we doing all these reforms? Because we're finding that we need to be able to basically deliver development solutions quicker, because poverty had been actually slowing down. But with COVID and with all the conflicts and fragility around the world, we had seen poverty pick up again. Secondly, we have seen growth be so uneven after COVID. Now it's stabilizing, but it's still so insufficient, and it's still lower than it was before COVID. So we know we have to pick up on that. And thirdly, so many countries are facing so many challenges: climate change, indebtedness, natural disasters, but also now, unfortunately, so much instability and conflict in the world. So we at the World Bank Group just feel like we need to think, how do we help our clients deliver faster? One is we need to be able to provide more resources. So we have been really looking at all the recommendations coming out of the G20 reports, ideas on how we can maximize and optimize our balance sheet, but also really importantly, making sure we have a strong IDA 21 replenishment this year. That's, of course, our fund for the poorest.
The International Development Association.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And a quick update on IDA. Since our episode on the International Development Association, they were actually able to raise $100 billion in financing. That'll go to the world's poorest countries over the next 3 years. It's IDA's largest ever fundraising. Anna relayed to me her goal in trying to make the World Bank's project implementation faster. She says they're taking almost 2 years to prepare a project. So far, they've reduced that timeline to 16 months. She's hoping to bring that average down to 12 months by June. There was something else I wanted to ask Anna about. It's a little sensitive as it relates to geopolitics. Over the past decade, we know China's become one of the biggest lenders to lower income countries, even dwarfing the World Bank, IMF, or all 22 Paris Club governments combined. When you look at that statistic, what is your sense of how you counter the Chinese influence? Do you work with them? Do you create a whole separate institution? What really works in helping those communities be able to move quickly?
Yeah. So I think that the development agenda is one that needs everybody to come around and to work as a collective. And China has its own very, very powerful development story. Mm-hmm. China has managed to lift so many people out of poverty. A lot of countries are actually learning from China's experience. China has also, and I actually had the chance to visit China back in 2017 or so, 2018, invested a lot in developing renewable energy capacity, which has also benefited the deployment of renewable energy around the world. So I think we need to not think about it as, dividing countries or institutions, but really thinking about how do we all work together for the benefit of really the poorest countries, having access to knowledge, finance, convening, catalyzing, and mobilization. Mm-hmm. And to that extent, I think China has an important role to play to make sure that countries can attract financing, can have good governance, can make sure that it can account for the development gains that it achieves, if and when they also take on indebtedness. And that's been very important for us. And here we're happy to be able to see now that even though it's very difficult for countries to go through a process of debt sustainability assessments and even debt restructuring in some ways, but having the G20 common framework where everybody comes together around the table, including all both official creditors and commercial creditors, has been very important.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you, though, about some of the innovative tools, such as gender bonds and blended finance. First, can you explain what a gender bond is and blended finance? And also, how big a part of the funding mix do you think that these two things can realistically be?
Yeah. So, just starting with blended finance, what blended finance does is basically help buy down the cost of something that would otherwise not be your viable option. So you're bringing in commercial funding with a bit of concessional funding to make a project or an initiative bankable at the end of the day. So blended finance is something that I think IFC, for example, our private sector arm, sees as a major way to be able to make headway into either really risky markets or new markets where innovation and a bit of that incentive is needed. So I'm a big believer in blended finance, and that's where I think the World Bank Group is also powerful, because we can bring public-private together. We can bring concessional with commercial together. So I think that's very important. We have in the last few years played with so many different types of bonds. We have had, sustainability bonds, rhino bonds, why not have a gender bond? And what it basically means is that, you tap into a set of investor base that has an interest in a theme like gender equality, like sustainability, like biodiversity, and you're broadening the base of investors coming in where they're looking to support a government or a program that actually has an objective which speaks to you. And in this case, it would be achievements, progress, results in the case of gender. So I think why not? If we can do sustainability bonds, we should be able to do gender bonds.
You visit many countries on behalf of the World Bank and often write and talk about these experiences. What have been some of the most inspiring gender equality projects that you've seen lately? I know you recently also went to India.
Yeah.
What comes to mind when you first think about these projects?
Yeah. Look, I think to see women take charge of their livelihood and income is very inspiring. It's inspiring because it gives them hope and dignity, and you see it in them. But what I think is particularly compelling is also we have now evidence that when women have economic empowerment, they make decisions that tend to be better for the future generation. So we've seen a positive correlation between women earning income and women's income going up with, for example, focus and spending on climate action or on education outcome of the next generation, because women are making decisions for the next generation. And it's pretty compelling, and we have the evidence for it.
There's also a program in India about increasing women's labor force participation, that they're actually hostels for working women. Can you tell me?
I visited those, yes.
Tell me about that.
So this is really interesting what India has done on this. So this is for women who live in rural areas who seek jobs or are studying, basically getting a degree. But because it's very hard to commute back and forth from your rural area to the urban area where either the job is or the program that you're studying for is. So they've established a number of these hostels, and I visited one of them. And it's basically like a dormitory for women, by women, which is very safe. So in order to get in, there's biometric controls, for example. So the safety is there. They build them close to transportation solutions or transportation means. So women also feel they can safely go either on a tram or on a bus. So it's just been very smartly thought through that the only way to get women from rural areas to seek jobs in urban areas where more of the jobs are, or to study for a degree or a vocational training solution, you need to provide the infrastructure for women. And so I met with women, I met with parents who were visiting their daughters there, and they just feel very comfortable having their daughters be there and advancing in their either careers or advancing in their skills. So I think this is a nice homegrown solution, if you will, that it really seems to work. And because India can do this, India takes it to scale in a way many other countries are learning from India to do.
You know, it wasn't until we taped this podcast season that I realized how important transportation is for the workforce for women. Like, you've got to figure out that piece for so many women to just be able to get to work. As we head into 2025, what's your biggest hopes and what's your biggest fear as you're here at the World Bank and working on the policy that you're working on?
I mean, they go together. I'd like to see more peace and stability in the world, because without that, it's very hard to get sustained economic and social development. So my biggest hope is that we see that. My biggest fear is that we don't see it, to be very honest. Secondly, I'd like us to be able to really break the back of these problems around gender inequality once and for all, which is why I'm really committed to these big targets that we have set for ourselves.
Anna, so grateful to be with you on this special day here at the World Bank. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
I really appreciated Anna Bjerde's optimism heading into 2025. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's been a lot of instability, a lot of uncertainty over the last few years, but there's also a lot of reason to be hopeful. Both Anna Bjerde and Hana Brixi have witnessed firsthand how sustained investment can lead to meaningful change to the world's most vulnerable communities. They envision a world where fighting for gender equality is not seen as a side project or an expendable goal, but rather a key component for economic growth and a value that leads to justice and fairness for all. Leaving DC after my whirlwind of conversations with leaders and policymakers, I was struck by the tenacity and ingenuity of so many who want to provide opportunities for women and girls. There's no doubt that the challenges ahead are great, but so too are the plans in place to meet those challenges. I actually left the meetings with a sense of optimism, that momentum is moving in a positive direction, but there's no time to let off on the gas. And that wraps it up for Season 7 of The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women. We've got a new season coming to you in March, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on what we should cover. You can email us at podcast@foreignpolicy.com with any and all ideas. The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women is a production of Foreign Policy. This season, we're supported by the Gates Foundation, Northwestern University's Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, and the Atlantic Council. The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women is hosted by me, Reena Ninan. Laura Rosbrow-Tellem is our senior producer. Rob Sachs, our managing director. And Angela Zhang produced this episode. Thanks so much. We'll be back in your feed in the new year.